Welcome back. We're so glad to have you back with us. You know, in session one, I said something and I need to clarify it. I need to correct it. And I said, you need to call Nick if you have any questions. And what you really need to do is follow his advice as he was giving it and follow the pamphlet. And once you've filed your income tax, then I'm going to let Nick explain from there on exactly what you can do. But we're going to be talking about now how the IRS can file or audit a person's tax return. And Nick is going to go ahead and cover that for us.
Great, thank you, Tom. And this is oftentimes where we step in as a low-income taxpayer clinic and help people.
Okay.
And there are two different scenarios where people end up owing if they didn't file their own accurate tax return or if they just happen to be chosen to be audited.
Okay.
So first I'll talk about people who are required to file a tax return and don't do it by the April 15th deadline. And in that situation, the IRS can prepare what's called a substitute for return.
Oh.
What's really interesting from a legal perspective is that a substitute for return, the federal law actually lets the IRS do that at any time. There's no legal deadline. So let's say, Tom, that you were required to file a 2015 tax return and you didn't by April 15th of the following year.
Okay.
In 5 years, in 10 years, theoretically in 100 years, the IRS could prepare and file it for you.
Ah.
And that's bad for a whole number of reasons. One is the uncertainty of it, because you're sitting there thinking, will the IRS prepare a tax return for me? And if they do, when will that be? And you have no idea.
Okay.
The only thing you can do about that is immediately file your own accurate tax return. Because the substitute for return is also bad because if it happens, the taxpayer misses out on credits. They don't get a refund they might otherwise be entitled to receive. And if they owe, they're going to owe more with a substitute for return than if they filed their own.
There are penalties and all the other things that go with it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's a plethora of penalties. So for example, there's one called the failure to file.
Okay.
So that's another reason why it's always great to file by the deadline, because better to not have to face that penalty and have less that you have to pay.
Absolutely. Okay. I know we have people who, like you just said, may not file for a particular year. If they come in and file the next year by trying to skip that 1 year, what happens?
Generally speaking, the IRS sees things year by year. So the fact that you haven't filed a previous tax return should not at all really, in most cases, change you filing the next year's return.
Okay.
So you should just go ahead, the usual process, and file that one by the deadline. And in fact, generally, free tax preparation sites don't go back in the past with earlier past due returns.
Okay.
But there is one actually a couple in Las Vegas, I believe, that do that for those who are able to drive out there. One is the Nevada Free Taxes Coalition, and I believe there may be a couple others that I'm blanking on.
But one of the things you mentioned was if they did not file, say, the previous year, they're filing this year by the deadline, and the IRS could then file that other one for them. And they'd still be in somewhat a conundrum. They don't know exactly where they stand.
Right, and they can go ahead and file late. It's just better to file on time than late.
Yes.
So that's one way that people can end up owing when they wouldn't usually is a
Okay.
substitute for return. The other one is the audit process, which is also called examination of the tax return. And what's really important to keep in mind about both of these, whether it's a substitute for return or an audit, is things don't happen overnight. The IRS can't just change your tax return. They can't just say, hey, you owe taxes, and you do. It's always a process.
Okay.
So that's why it's so critical to open, the second you get it, any letter or notice from the Internal Revenue Service. What's important to keep in mind, too, is that it's through the mail. If you get a call and they say, hey, this is such and such from the Internal Revenue Service, be skeptical, because they would only call you if you're already working with them. And if you have any doubt, simply end the phone call politely, go to irs.gov, get a phone number, call them and say, hey, I got a call from someone saying it's the IRS. what's going on here. That way you're certain of.
Okay. Always check. And again, we do get letters. Now, what about the fraudulent letters that you may get?
There are those too, and the unfortunate reality is some fraudsters are sophisticated.
Okay.
So sometimes there'll be a letter that comes in because there's a notice of federal tax lien filed and it's a public record. And it can be a company that is unscrupulous and they make up a form number and you read the fine print and it says, apply now for a loan. And there's even actually a current notice called a CP2000 that's fraudsters are sending. So got to read it really carefully and call the number on it. Go to the website to get a phone number and verify it if you have any question. But opening the mail, reading it, and thinking about it and replying is really the first critical step in all of this stuff.
Okay.
Because like most legal rights, use it or lose it. Timing is essential.
Well, I like the fact that you say you can go to the IRS and call them and say, look, I've received this letter. And they may tell you, no, that didn't come from us.
And by far, IRS employees are professional, they're courteous, they know what they're doing.
Okay.
Some people are scared of the IRS, and while there are a few bad apples here and there, the vast majority are very helpful. So people should not ever hesitate to contact them to work through it. And what's important too is when calling the IRS, be sure to take careful notes. The day you called them, the phone number, the time even, who you spoke with, their identification number, and a summary, not a transcript, but a summary of what was discussed and deadlines. If you send a document to the IRS, be sure to first copy it for your records. Okay. If you can afford to, pay for certified mail so that you can track it, make sure the IRS gets it. And speaking of documents, what's really important with the IRS is to document items on your tax return. If you claim a dependent, document that they lived with you for more than half of the tax year. Income, document it. Things you have to show to prove for a credit, document that. Because usually the IRS has 3 years from the time you file to audit your return. Usually because that 3 years only begins, if you file on time, on April 15th. So because this can get a bit theoretical, let's use an example. Let's say you file your tax return for 2016 on March 1st of 2017. Okay. It's on time. So the 3-year clock begins to tick on April 15th of 2017. Okay. So that's 18, 19, 20. They have until April 15th of 2020 to examine the tax return. Okay. If you file late, the 3-year clock only begins to run once you actually file. So another reason to file by the deadline.
Absolutely. You know, anybody that receives a notice that they're going to be audited, that's when the panic sets in.
That's right.
So what should they do when they get that? You've told them what documents to have, and that's very accurate. So again, pay attention. You can write this down as he's telling you, and try to be prepared for that audit. It's not going to stop your heart from beating fast, but what else should they do?
Well, once they open it, read it, process it, a lot of these IRS notices and letters, they actually talk about low-income taxpayer clinics, LITCs like the one where I work. And what we do is, for those who are lower income, basically who can't afford their own attorney, we provide free representation and advice to them.
Oh, great.
So we don't charge our clients for what we do. Okay. And so that's certainly an option people have. If they don't qualify for our assistance because they have too much income, too many assets, then there's nothing wrong with needing assistance. This stuff can be complex. So they could contact a tax attorney. Okay. They could contact a CPA. They could contact an enrolled agent, because those 3 categories of professionals are able to represent someone before the IRS. Okay.
Now, you mentioned the low income. Now, here in Pahrump, we have, in Nye County, we have the VITA program, Volunteer Income Tax Assistance. How does that relate to what you do?
And I'm glad you bring that up because VITA is a great program. And it's also a great collaboration we have because they do what we can't do as an LITC. They prepare current tax returns. We do what they can't do. We practice law. We represent people before the Internal Revenue Service.
Okay.
So the difference between what we do as an LITC and VITA sites is kind of like, I know the foreclosure crisis is slowing down, but between a HUD-certified housing counselor and a foreclosure attorney, it can be a great relationship the two have with each other. So again, this stuff is not overnight. So what happens if the taxpayer and the IRS can't resolve the examination or they can't resolve the substitute for return? Because for both of those, you have a chance to respond. The IRS is required to mail what's called a notice of deficiency.
Okay.
And that's something that a person has to sign for because it's sent certified mail. And it's just a really, really important process because it gives a person the right to go to court to dispute what they owe. And so there's this court called the United States Tax Court, which is the only one in the country where you can dispute the tax amount the IRS says you owe without first having to pay all of the alleged tax amount in full, which most people simply can't do. So a person, if they've received a notice of deficiency and they've got a good argument, should start a tax court case within the time that they have to do that.
You know, when I look at that, and I have never received that notice. I've been audited several times, and because I like income taxes, I've relished it. I've enjoyed going in for an audit. I know that sounds crazy, but no, that's...
But you bring up a great point. The sooner people address this stuff, the sooner you do, the better off you are. Because if there's an examiner assigned to your file to audit your return, best to try to work it out then. And if that doesn't work, then you can go to court versus ignoring it and then kicking the can down the road and waiting too late in the process or making it more formal than it would have to be.
Absolutely. Okay, as always, we're running out of time on this session, but we're going to be coming back for the next session, and we're going to be talking about IRS steps toward collection action, and we've got a lot going on. So again, keep that paper, keep those pens and pencils handy, and take down all the information you can, and come back and join us next session.